أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر ولله الحمد.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Conversations about Beauty and Islamic Theology, a series where we explore the rich and diverse intersections between theology, art, and mysticism. Now, today it is our absolute pleasure to host Professor Samer Akkash. Professor Akkash is Professor of Architectural History and Theory at the School of Architecture and Built Environment, University of Adelaide, and the founding director of the Centre for Asian and Middle Eastern Architecture, founded in 1997. The Centre is dedicated to addressing the demand for new cross-cultural understanding of architecture in the context of major global shifts in the environment, technology, and culture. Now, today we will be discussing some of the aspects of Professor Akkash's fascinating research on mysticism and architecture, as developed in his landmark work, Cosmology and Architecture in Pre-Modern Islam, published in 2007. Professor Akkash, welcome. It's a real pleasure to have you with us today.
Thanks, Bilal. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you and to be able to speak about my work.
So, Professor, I thought I would start with a very general question, which is, how does a study of architecture offer a way to understand patterns of thought in the Islamic period? And perhaps you can also speak to us about the types of buildings that you also look at in your work.
I think for these questions, particularly when we talk about patterns of thought, we need to really to distinguish between pre-modern and modern Islamic architecture or Islamic time, taking into account also the 19th century, which is a transitional period, very important period where things have actually changed during that. So in modern time, when we talk about sort of architecture and in relation to intellectual history or in relation to any kind of pattern of thought, we're speaking about the agency of the architects and architecture theories, which are clearly expressed, and the sort of the relationship is about what they think and what they write and what the way that they express themselves. This is quite clear, and within that we can sort of, for example, look at the sort of a spectrum of various modern Islamic architects, the way that they get taught and what they read and the philosophy that they rely on. So you can establish that relationship. I think that there's no issues with this, particularly that's starting from the 19th century onward. And now, prior to this, we don't actually have literature on architecture, and we don't have theory of architecture. So in pre-modern time, we have fantastic buildings, but we really don't know what did the architect how did the architect thought about them, how they came up with what they've designed and what they sort of produce in the end. So that makes it actually difficult. So when we talk about pattern of thought, we don't really have that sort of aspect of architecture to be able to do the documentation. Now, this made it worth by art historians or art historical approach who actually divorced themselves from intellectual history. So art history now, the way that art history look at Islamic art and architecture, do not concern themselves with intellectual history. In other words, do not concern themselves with pattern of thought, because this is an aspect that is so sort of tenuous, and it has sort of very vague relationship with what the building are, because we don't really have text to say, look, this particular architect have actually studied under this particular, for example, religious authority or philosophical authority, and then using this material, he came and designed this building. We just don't have that. So the relationship remains really open to the way that we would like to sort of construct relationship between them. And the way that I went about it in my writing is to try not to rely on historical, like, the mandatory elements of art history, of historical evidence, trying to sort of always show the historical evidence of how certain things designed, because we simply don't have that. But to have the logic of the timing of it. Let's say if you've got a set of buildings in a particular period or a particular time, and you've got say people who lived around that time who actually wrote certain aspects about sort of Islamic philosophy or theology or mysticism, and you can detect the relationship between them without actually having to produce that kind of tangible link between them. I think that should be enough to show how certain elements represent intellectual developments. So this is the way I go about it, and I focus particularly in my writings on Sufism or mysticism because of the richness of the material that you can find in that. Now, the other things that I also focus on in my work is that I try to look at certain common things that occurs, like particularly in cosmology and architecture, because if it's sort of a broad perspective, it looks at a particular aspect of spatial organization, and these spatial organizations are not really geographically specific. Like, for example, take the sort of the way that the building sort of laid out around a sort of axial symmetry. I mean, you can find it in India, you can find it in Iran, you can find it in the Middle East, you can find it in North Africa and Spain, and sort of consistently across time and space, you will find that there is that kind of pattern recurring. Our historical approach would like to actually think of each individual kind of, productions within its own socio-political and cultural context. I tried to say why all those people have organized this space in this particular way. So that opens the questions wider than the specific of the socio-cultural and political, and opens it up into a more sort of a cosmological sort of sense of thinking and a cosmological or sort of a wider intellectual sort of understanding of how architecture is produced. And particularly in the absence of the literature, this becomes quite useful. I don't know whether that actually make good sense.
No, absolutely. I think it's kind of highlighting the fact that there's this incredible body of architecture and art on the one side, and then you've got this huge, rich and diverse body of writing, intellectual thought, mystical writing, but there's no kind of smoking gun, there's no clear text which is linking the two. But one of the ways that you've done that is through exploring how, kind of establishing a sensibility in a way, right? That people are thinking in a particular way, creating their worldview in a particular way. And because of this reason, we're seeing parallels in text and we're seeing parallels in material culture. And is that what you mean by spatial sensibility, that the text gives a kind of, well, maybe perhaps you can speak about, what does that mean, the spatial sensibility?
I think spatial sensibility is inherently vague, and I think the vagueness of it is important in a way. What I mean is that because nowadays we tend to rely on justifying what we do through our intention. So the intentionality plays quite a strong role. So there is that kind of theorizations or layers of theorizations, which I argued in my book is that not necessarily a constructive thing when we think about pre-modern, because we lack that theorizations and the intentionality, the clear intentionality as what is intended to be done. We need to look beyond that into what I considered is a kind of a natural predisposition. Like we tend to do things according to what we think is natural. So it's a natural to do things in a certain way for us, in certain time, but we can actually see that things have actually changed. Like we no longer order space in the same way that pre-modern Muslim architects and produce it, and that we no longer sort of respect that axial symmetry. For example, in each and every space that is being produced, you get that kind of axial symmetry, whether it's sort of an enclosed space or whether it's a big courtyard or whether it's a complex, a whole complex. And of course, there are little things that does not comply to this, but the majority of the major work all observes that. So what I argue is that this kind of spatial sensibility reflects a sort of a complexity of awareness that is determined by a number of things, which is sort of cosmological concern, like understanding cosmological order, by sort of intellectual work that relates to a notion of space, notion to human body, notion to the geography, and how those relate together to construct our relationship to space. For example, in the pre-modern world, where the cosmology was all around concentric universe, within at the center of which there was the human being placed deliberately, and the space being also being introduced with a limitation that is based on it's a three-dimensionality. There is no four dimensions. I mean, I know we can, when we speak about sort of curvilinear geometry, can talk about multiple dimension, and with the string theories and all the other modern cosmology they take about. But fundamentally, from the architectural point of view, you can only construct a three perpendicular axis from one particular point in space. So really, I mean, this is so fundamental to our space, and I think pre-modern thinkers, whether they were mystics or philosophers or theologians, they considered this as being the kind of the signature of the divine on the way that the world was being designed. And the architect, I believe that they've respected that. They thought, if you are going to design, if God actually put that limitation in the design, we should respect that, and we should reproduce it in what we do. So you will feel that there is a kind of analogical correspondence between the way they thought about the human body based on the same kind of structure, the universe based on the same kind of structure, geography based on the same kind of structure. So there's that kind of structural resonance that they have produced. Now that structural resonance produced that spatial sensibility, because this is what appeared to them natural. This is this sensibility in the way. This is not theorized. I mean, not theorized in the sense that I need to justify why I would actually establish this symmetrical layout. There's no justification. There's no need to justify. There's no need to theorize it, and there's no need to aestheticize it as well. So it's nothing to do with being so beautiful or being, or has particular intentionality. It's just being natural, because this is how we should do things. And this is how we should do things, is that predisposition, natural predisposition. It's a sensibility that grows with us and it changes over time. Now we actually, all that kind of structural resonance and the complementarity of all these elements that to do with space, from the cosmic to the architecture, completely being broken. We don't see the relevance. We don't see the relationship between it. So our sensibility is completely different. So that is why we don't actually see it natural to do things. If you want to do it this way, we'll have to justify it. So we have to have an intention for it. So I think this is where I started my point of thinking, and that is why then architecture, when I used it in my work, I didn't use actually all the theoretical construct to justify why this is being done. In fact, I did it the other way around. I said, here is the spatial order. What does that spatial orders enable us to understand? Then that would allow me to actually go to the mystical material, to go to philosophical material, to religious material, try to understand what is the resonance of this in all these various field. And I found this a really extraordinarily kind of illuminating, because it started to introduce me to field of thinking that architects don't think about these days, or don't have access to these days. So does that answer the question?
Please carry on. Sorry.
Yeah. So really, this is my my way of actually dealing with that spatial sensibility. And I still think that more could actually be done about it, because the more we understand about their sort of the pre-modern positions on the human structure, geography, technology, science from their perspectives, and all those, it will allow us to understand how they approach space and what it meant to be for them to be a sort of spatial being, wanting to construct or make things in the human world, which I always thought that, you know, considering the way that I started my book and referring to, you know, theological work of Al-Ghazali, is, you know, he gave us a really very eloquent example of how the architects sort of think of themselves in relation to the divine.
I think one of the really interesting parts of the book was, right, I mean, the one that kind of set the tone for me was when you spoke about how, because in our modern context, we think of the universe as constantly expanding. We forget that people in the past saw it as something that could be systematized or something that could be ordered in a particular way. And for us, that's such a foreign approach to the universe. And so that for me really set the tone for understanding how people could have this kind of spatial sensibility. And I think it's a really fascinating idea, the way in which it's not, you're not arguing, I mean, this is from my understanding of your text, you're not arguing that people are intentionally aware of all of their sensibilities. It's rather, it kind of permeates into the architect, and that's why it's not theorized. You know, he's kind of being in that particular moment where he's surrounded by certain text and certain ideas, and it's reflected in the way that we see the architecture laid out. I thought perhaps it would be great if you could perhaps speak about maybe one or two of those ideas, maybe in the writing of Ibn al-Arabi, and then perhaps we can see how that relates to certain spaces or certain buildings.
I think one of the way that sort of Ibn Arabis and other mystics have sort of looked at this relationship, particularly the notion of the human presence, or what is in Arabic is the notion of al-hadra al-insaniya, or human presence, and as opposed to the divine presence. So they've got sort of two presences that are, they see it as sort of complementing each other, and at the same time reflecting each other in many ways. And that presence constitute material presence, physical presence, a spatial presence, and at the same time intellectual, and, you know, in relation to knowledge and various other things. But really the physical presence is important, because here we are dealing with architecture, and the notion of a presence leads to thinking about how, for example, the world is constructed, like what are the sort of the structural basic structural element of the world, and particularly when thinking about it in an enclosed sense, in the pre-modern sense, which would give the humanities an important role in that. Now, as you said, in contemporary cosmology, we are completely, you know, kind of, you know, meaningless in the spread of space, and so we are just a sort of a meaningless dot somewhere in the infinite universe, that we have no significance. There's no sense of significance to our presence cosmologically. You know, once you get into that model, we're completely pointless. Like, you know, we just don't know what's the purpose, in fact, of, you know, that dot that exists in that infinity. Now, the immensity of the world did exist in the past, but we were at the center. Now, probably, you know, spatially, if we were going to sort of, you know, look at it from, you know, from, let's say, the sort of divine and a human perspective, as long as, you know, there have been sort of a lot of writings about, you know, whether there has been any other civilizations. Are we alone in the universe? Are we the, you know, the unique creature that we thought that we are, and you know, that sort of stuff, which I think is fine. I think it is sort of a strong pursuit of modern science, but as long as we don't have the other sort of competitors, as it were, we're still central in the cosmos. Right? Whether we are spatially at center, whether we are the center of the entire cosmological structure. But traditionally, that was taken for granted. You know, we are being placed at the center, and the centrality in terms of geometry and structure, the centrality reflects the. If you look at that in terms of a sort of a sphere, we are the center, and the divine is beyond the circumference of that sphere. so there is that kind of resonance, and the geometry provides a very powerful tool for Sufis to think about. Like, you cannot actually have a circumference without a center. So a god would not actually be a god without actually having someone that would be sitting on the other side. So, you are the Lord of something. You are, particularly when you look at the manifestation of the divine name, they're always related to that center. So without us being the center, there would be no, nothing that exists outside. So there is that kind of dialectic relationship between the two, which I think was spatially an important point, because then that will always show that we are such an important creatures in the universe. And of course, the sacred text emphasizes that we've been sort of given even the burdens of having to look after that creation. And the fact that it's actually seen as, if we want to do something, if you want to design something, you've got actually to carry the responsibility of being imitating the divine creation. So I think this is what, in my view, that what made that kind of spatial sensibility such a natural thing and an immediate. And of course, people would say that, and art historians and others, there's always established traditions, and those traditions sort of establish certain things, and then people come back and continue on with those traditions. And it was common not to disrupt that traditional thing. And it's true, that kind of spatial order is not particularly Islamic in its production, because it's pre-Islamic, like your previous civilization also used the same kind of structure. But I think the continuity is important because there has been no breaking up of that kind of cosmological awareness. So Muslims did not actually see the taking over or continuing on with that tradition as being contrary to their religious belief or cultural identities, because that was consistent in the way that the cosmology is being actually seen. Now, the moment human lost their centrality, say after Copernicus, and the moment that we're kind of lost in space, we have no central position anymore. I think you can actually see it in the diversity of the things that are being sort of created these days, and the kind of I'm not trying. I don't want to be negative about this, but I'm trying to actually say that this is now our modern condition, but our modern condition really reflect our spatial sensibility, which we are kind of have no centrality in anything that we do, because we just happen to be here on Earth, and eventually we're going to sort of disappear. There's no significance beyond that kind of moment that we live. Whereas traditionally there was kind of that significance, because ultimately you are connected, and you are here for a purpose, and you'll be sort of going back to continue on your life in different forms. So there's the whole range of issues that that we face today that was completely different in the past, and I think that plays an important role in the way that we think about buildings and architecture.
How about like maybe the context of the Kaaba, if we can just use one example? How would we say that the Kaaba reflects some of these cosmological principles in its exact form?
I think the Kaaba is an interesting one, and an interesting one in showing also how traditionally they used to think about form, because now in modern times we are so obsessed with form and the aesthetics of form, and the way that we deal with form and the meaning of form, and all the theories that we construct with form. But the Kaaba was quite an important sacred, let's say, sacred site. But if you look at the traditional cosmology, the way it has been constructed from the time Prophet and continued on really until the time that modern cosmology changed the structure of the universe, is that you've got that cosmic structure, the Earth in the center, so the humanity in the center, and the center of the Earth was constructed to be the actual position of the Kaaba. So here is we are at the center, and here's the center of the center. So in terms of the powerful symbolism of that is that this is the most important things ever, that because this is really the essence of everything. And if you look at various prophetic sayings and other descriptions, they speak about sort of an axial relationship with the pole star, for example, and the axial relationship with the multiple stories of heavens, where there is a replicas of the Kaaba in each of the skies. There's 14 of them. And there's a prophetic saying or a hadith that actually say that if one falls on the top of the other, they will actually keep falling until they fall on the top of the Kaaba. So there's that kind of axial relationship, and there is a visual representation that actually shows that. So that in terms of its axial position. Now, architecturally, it's a cube. And you would have thought that if it is such a venerated and important form as a cube, which is, in fact, it is not entirely a cube, it's a kind of cube. The dimensions are not equal. You would have thought that there will be a lot of building cubic form all over the Islamic world, but we don't see this actually, because what is important for them, it is not that is the cubic form, but what it actually that cube represent, and that brings us back to my central element, which is the three-dimensionality of space. And the three-dimensionality of space as a sort of three axes, it embodies in form. The first embodiment in form is the cube. And in fact, if you look also at the human body, the way it's being conceptualized, it's conceptualized around the three axes, which is based on the three dimension and six direction. And in fact, it's all based on this particular point, which is at the bottom of our spine, which is called actually in Arabic, Ajbu Zana. And it says the whole constructions of a human being is based on this particular point, which does not perish when we perish. So there is that kind of point, the centrality of which is exactly the same. This is the position of the Kaaba, and this is what represents spatially in the cosmos. This is that point around which the three dimensions of space is being constructed. And you can see this repeated over and over and over and over in multiple ways. So what is being copied or what is being replicated or what's being sort of perpetuated is that understanding of the centrality of the point and the three-dimensionality that emerged from it. And then that takes a multiplicity of forms in terms of shapes and colors but you will, any situation where you see that symmetrical layout, there is always that representation of that point, which is the Kaaba represent, which is the lower point of the spine, which is called actually in European, in medieval Europe, it's called the sacrum. And the sacrum comes from the sacred. So this is that point. So there is some commonality in the way that the human structure is being perceived in Christian Europe and Islamic world. That is all based on this point, and this point which does not perish, because there has to be something around which that the human what's called a nash'a reconstructed. So let's say, how the Quran would actually say that there is the first construction or the first formation, and there is the second formation. Second formation, once people dies, and so there has to be a reconstructed. So that we don't know the speciality of the second formation, but what we know is that there is a particular point, which is the center of it, that is going to continue, because they say that this doesn't perish. Now, whether it is materially doesn't perish or conceptually doesn't perish doesn't really matter. I mean, what matters for us is that there has to be some kind of continuity. So if the human structure has this, and if the cosmos have that that centrality, and the Kaaba represented, they can actually see the spatial relationship and the way it's been continually reproduced in medieval Islam through various spatial construction, that that point is not really visible. You've got to actually think about it in that kind of spatial sensibility. It means something for them because it is always there. You think about it, it's always there. But they have not theorized it or aestheticized it in a way that we expect today in order for things to make sense for us. But it should make sense to, I mean, for those who would go beyond form, would see where the, you know, the meaning of this sort of lies in the way that particular point opens up a whole world of interpretations about, you know, the unity and the divinity and God and you know. So and numbers and geometry plays the mediation roles between you know, thinking about, you know, material world and thinking about the divine world, and the way that they think about them as being corresponding all the time. There is nothing that sort of, you know, separate them. Whereas now we completely separated from those, because all those cosmological, I mean, we no longer think in cosmological terms. Cosmology is completely alien to us now. We may actually sort of, you know, think about cosmology, and particularly the you know, various cosmological theories. It became so complicated that it's become irrelevant to our everyday life. And once it becomes irrelevant to everyday life, we go on doing things in our work. Maybe now the spatiality of cyberspace and, you know, social medias and all that sort of, this is more relevant to us to think about them, to think in that term and actually affect the way that our spatial sensibility is made, rather than the way that it was in the past.
I think that, I mean, the idea of the point is a really fascinating one, because it's really enlivened by ritual, especially with the Kaaba, when you see people like doing tawaf, for example. If you have this bird's eye perspective, it really accentuates this idea, which raises broader questions of how these ideas relate to ritual and performance. And I think it's a really fascinating subject.
I think it's important, because if you look at a lot of maps that's being produced in medieval time, they always, you know, have the Kaaba at the center, and then you have all the mosques, you know, being represented by circles, like, you know, all the niches, all the mihrab by niches that's around it. So the geography being kind of concentrated around that center, which is a geography that makes sense to people. This is how they see the world. They see themselves always orienting themselves toward the Kaaba. But the actual material geography does not mean much. I'll tell you one story, which has actually been reported by An-Nabulsi, one of his trips to Jerusalem. He used to go and visit all those, you know, the tombs of the saints and all the sort of burial grounds, and get to meet people and talk. Now, they went to one place, and they were talking about a particular saint that was very venerated in that region, and they were telling him about the story of how this particular tomb was constructed. He said that the person who constructed the tomb was a Christians, and in fact Christians were known to actually be part of the building industry. I mean, like, for example, Jews were part of also the medical and industry, and so they used to actually do quite a lot of constructions. And they said that as he was, he saw in a dream that this saint appeared to him, and he converted to Islam. And so he went to the son of that saint and said, "Look, I want to construct a tomb on the top of this of the grave." And then the son said, "Look, you know, I don't have money to pay." He said, "Look, don't worry about it. I'll do it myself, when, you know, slowly as I'm sort of doing my work." So he continued to do it, and he finished the whole things, and then he went up to the top. He wanted to put the crescent on the top of the dome. As he went up, he suddenly that he was in Jerusalem. That's in a city called Qabatia, by the way. You know, but you know, you're talking about the area of Palestine. And as he went up, he sort of looked around, and he found, you know, he saw things that was completely alien, and so he called the son of the saint, who's actually buried under the. So he came up and he said, "Look, you know, what is this? I can't, you know, this scene is not familiar to me." So there is a lot of palm trees, and there's no palm trees in there. So the son looked on and said, "Look, you know, this is Mecca and this is Medina." He was pointing out. So suddenly this guy when he completed, this is the kind of manifestation. See how it's actually important in people's lives. So as it's manifested, as he completed, and he, having sort of completed his vow to construct the house, suddenly Mecca, like, he could see actually Mecca from Palestine, Of course, this is a sort of a mythological story, but it actually reflects an understanding of how spatial relationship does not mean much. It is the actual value of the, or the virtue of the relationship between Mecca and what Mecca and Medina means to people, that they could transform the entire geography in order to be seen as a reward for having done something so virtuous and having sort of converted to Islam. And so he was actually, then they said he was overwhelmed with that scene. So he was, because he converted in secret, and then afterward he sort of declared his Islam. And so, but it is important to understand, this is part of spatial sensibility, where geography, it is not controlled by, the literal relationship between the map and the land. It is more about, the sacred relationship between the spot and how this plays in people's life in order to, create those kind of story that becomes quite meaningful, quite powerful. So this is, I found it extremely interesting in the way that Mecca, its centrality, Mecca and the Kaaba, its centrality sort of shapes up even people's understanding of space and relationship, visual relationship to space.
And Professor, as far as just as a final question, as far as I understand, you're also trained as an architect and you teach architecture. Is that right?
I teach architecture.
It's not just the history, but the practical. You're like a rare figure in the history of art, where you're an actual practitioner. And I was just wondering, do you ever, these kinds of texts that you read, does it ever filter into the production of work, or in your teaching and the way that you encourage people to approach buildings? Does it have a practical relevance for you in your day-to-day occupation?
Oh, that's interesting questions. Actually, it's a difficult one in the sense that first of all, I don't really teach what I research. I mean, this is probably sort of the reflections of modern academia. I am trained as an architect, and I practiced as an architect for several years. But now I'm completely a researcher, but in the context of architecture, I don't teach these things. You see, this is one of the ironies, and because of segregation or separations of what we do. So I'll have to teach architecture in a completely technical and theoretical sense that is dictated by modern sensibility. So I have to put a barrier between them. So I can't actually introduce those ideas into the studio because they are irrelevant for today. They are not really. Of course, everything we do, we would like to learn from in order to improve our position and our understanding. But it becomes really a personal pursuit mostly. It is difficult to introduce those ideas into the learning context when it is our spatial sensibility and our approach and our thinking and our understanding of those completely different. So I will have to keep it actually kind of private. I just wanted to actually point out one thing because it's relation. Because initially, when you approached me, it was the whole idea of theology and aesthetics and theology and aesthetic, and also in relation to architecture. Is that just wanted to make a point about theology.
Sure.
Theology in a traditional Islamic context, it's very kind of complex to define because as we now define it, it actually relates to what we call ilm al-kalam. But ilm al-kalam is more sort of focused on disputations and the proofs of the of sort of issue to do with divinities and God. And it is not in the sort of general sense of theology as being the sort of divine sciences, like, or the science of, or what we call العلم الإلهي أو الإلهيات. العلم الإلهي and إلهيات, if we think about them outside علم الكلام, because علم الكلام is quite unique, and I think that relationship between theology and علم الكلام is not all that helping in terms of sort of understanding how we can relate divinities and the studies of divinities into aesthetics and architecture. You've got actually to think about them in relation to philosophy and mysticism, because philosophy and mysticism, talks about this, and talks about also about morality and its relation to aesthetics, and whereas Ilm al-Kalam as a theology is quite different. So I wasn't quite sure whether you were concerned with theology as Ilm al-Kalam or al-Ilm al-Ilahi, because it depends on the technical position that you start with. But yes, we can look at aesthetics and theology in particularly within the context of mysticism, because that's where the divine sciences is actually being studied, and that's why one of the reasons why I focused on these aspects. So I wasn't quite sure which angle that you wanted to actually take it, particularly with in relation to theology.
Yeah, I mean, with theology, it's kind of difficult because we're using this kind of, like you said, Ilm al-Kalam is referring to that kind of dogmatic theology, which refers to this dialectic and argument and refutation. But when we're using theology, at least in the Western terminology, it kind of is an umbrella term in a way for many other things. And I think I would fully agree with you that the dogmatic debates don't necessarily lend themselves to understanding aesthetics or aesthetic sensibility, but most of that really comes from the mystical text and the theological text, and also people like Ruzbihan Buckley or people like Imam Ghazali, who can kind of, their work really incorporates all of these things in a kind of systematic way. So I mean, if we were to expand it, I guess it would be beauty and Islamic philosophy, mysticism, and theology as a better way, I think.
Yeah, I think the theology that being sort of linked to Ilm al-Kalam specifically, it's really an external aspect, because I mean, theology is a Western word anyway, so it came from a particular preoccupation, wanting to actually know what it sort of maps over, and it somehow they selected Ilm al-Kalam, which is quite strange, despite the fact that actually philosophers, they have, in all their writing, they have ilahiyat, tabi'iyat and ilahiyat, and also mystics, they also do that. Now, in terms of aesthetics, if I can actually just make one more comment, there hasn't been any writing, and this is really important. There hasn't been, because this is part of architecture productions and artistic production, there has been no systematic writing or a particular writing on aesthetics in Islamic tradition, just the way that architecture did not actually receive that kind of discourse that we find it in modern time. And Ilm al-Jamal, which has become part of the sort of modern discourse, you don't actually see writings on Ilm al-Jamal in tradition. So aesthetics, when I was actually looking at the way that I would like to engage with aesthetics, I found a number of fields. You've got aesthetics that within this scientific and natural science kind of sphere, which is like, for example, the work of optics, like Ibn al-Haytham and the philosophers who also wrote on natural science and their aspect of aesthetics, but not in a sort of modern sense. And then you've got, I think, the most important aspect, which is completely now, I believe, being overlooked, is poetry and rhetorics. And there is a particular science that's called Ilm al-Badi'a. And Ilm al-Badi'a actually deals with all the aesthetics of poetry. And that has completely been overlooked as being a source of aesthetics in Islamic tradition. They thought that was entirely literary, but in fact, there was no other writings on aesthetics that has that kind of sophisticated depth as the one on poetry. And if you look at particularly the sort of Middle Eastern world, the Middle Eastern Islamic world, rather than sort of Ottoman, Persians, Indians, and the Arab part of that, they didn't actually produce lots of drawings. Like, you know, we don't actually have the same miniature traditions the way that you actually see it in other cultural contexts. But you have quite a lot of poetic output. So they used to actually use poetry as being a way of expressing aesthetics, and Ilm al-Badi'a being really the essence of poetic expressions. I thought that should be brought into, you know, thinking about how art and architecture has been impacted by the aesthetics of poetry, which has completely been neglected. And I think that would and Ilm al-Badi'a also has its connection with other sort of religious aspect of it, because it's not just the poetic expression, but it also sort of present a particular understanding of, you know, al-ibda, which is al-badi'a, comes from ibda, which is creativity and innovations, and also al-badi'a related to, you know, one of the divine names. So it has that connection, but that is one aspect that's completely been neglected, and I think more research would be important on that, to see the sort of relationship between particularly aspect of beauty that is beyond just the personal preferences and liking. So yeah, that.
Yeah, because I think I would definitely have to agree with you, because I mean, my work in particular is on Islamic calligraphy and Islamic manuscripts, and we're fortunate in that tradition to have like treaties, like risalas, written by authors who are basically connoisseurs of, they can identify this is good calligraphy or this is bad calligraphy. And it's fascinating that the terminology they use is very similar to that which is used in poetics. So for example, they'll define like a well-written line is like jewels which are strung well on the line, which is basically how people describe poets who can put together words in a particular way to make like a necklace. And things like kinaya, things like tashbih, all of these terms are also used in the pedagogy of calligraphy, right? And again, in poetics, they form like such a fundamental part. So maybe for your next book, it can be poetic sensibility. Poetic sensibility would be a great article. I think it's a really necessary.
I did produce an article recently on the what's called oral geometry, which is referred to how geometry is not visual, but it's oral, and refer to how geometry actually also regulates poetries, and so maybe next time we'll have I'm glad that you're actually working on this, and you can actually see the immediate impact of Ilm al-Badi'a on at least productions of manuscripts, and which is really so vital, but completely overlooked. And so
well, even the kind of, in the realm of, to expand it beyond manuscripts, I guess the realm of creativity, poetry is not about, you know, there is a system there, right? I mean, people can be creative, but within the system. And it's the same with so much of traditional art, is there is so much realm for creativity, but there is a framework system there. And the genius of the poet is the one that can use these tools, but in a way which has never been done before, perhaps, but still has some kind of allegiance to the masters of the past in a way, you know. There's that friction, I guess, between tradition and innovation in poetry, which I think exists in general in Islamic art and architecture.
But when you look actually deeply at the terminology that's being used in Ilm al-Badi'a, and particularly in relation to poetry, you will find that the whole conception, they actually conceive of poetry as in architectural term, which I found it fascinating. You know, like, you know, starting from, you know, Bayt al-Sha'r, for example, and which is, you know, all about the house. You know, it's starting from that, and relationship between the different part of the poetic lines, and the way the poetic lines is structured has a terminology. All those terminologies are actually architectural, which is fascinating. So it shows that there has been a resonance between the two that completely overlooked in terms of, you know, because we are more concerned now with form rather than with sort of underlying kind of a structural system that shapes people understanding of what beauty is. And they considered this, and particularly with segregation, they considered this as a literary matter. It's not really to do with production of art and architecture. But considering that all the terminology, or most of the terminology, they thought about it in architectural terms, that actually prompted us to why did they think about it this way? Yeah, so maybe next time we'll do one on this.
Yeah, I would absolutely love to. Professor Akash, thank you so much for your time and your patience and your contributions and your insight. It's been it was fascinating for me to read your book, and now it's been even more rewarding to speak to you about it. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Bilal. Thank you for having me and giving me that opportunity. And I look forward to actually watching other videos in the series.
Inshallah. Thank you so much.
Wonderful.